to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Okay, Zero Books readers and listeners and viewers, this is the Zero Books podcast and live stream. And I'm wondering if people can hear me. You probably can hear me through Michael Brooks' phone, but you may not be able to hear me through this microphone. So tell me if you can hear me in the comments. And there's a delay between what we say and what they hear. But yeah, and by the way, this is Michael Brooks. We've had some technical difficulties. Either it's my microphone, which will mean we'll have to start this stream over again, or it's so someone says, "Yo, there's an echo." Yeah, that's because maybe, Michael, do you have earbuds you can plug into your phone so you can hear me, but it doesn't get picked up by your microphone?
Yeah, hold on 1 second. I'll grab earbuds. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So good. There's an echo, which means that this microphone is working for you, but not for Michael. He can't hear me. But we're going to be discussing his book, Against the Web, A Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. And this is what you're hearing. I think the echo is my voice and then his speaker, the speaker on his phone. So when
all right, you should be off speaker now. How's that?
Yeah, I think that's good. So
okay,
I'm not hearing an echo anymore. All right. So this is a workaround. Hopefully it will continue to work. And I wanted to welcome you, Michael, to the YouTube channel for Zero Books. I know most people who are watching know you very well. You're just about to have your book come out from Zero Books next month. And it's coming out at what seems like an inopportune time. When I had my first book come out, it came out right around the time that, I had a short story come out right around the time that Obama was reelected and nobody read it. And it's not the same kind of thing. Right. And so this seems like it's even more dramatic that your book is coming out at a time where all of our politics seem to be rearranging themselves. Everything's realigning. Of course, we're facing a global pandemic and a terrible crisis, but also the governmental responses to the crisis aren't regular. It depends on what day of the week it is as to who seems to be on the left and who seems to be on the right. I remember tweeting out, thank you, Comrade Mitt Romney, like last week, kind of ironically. So how do you feel people should approach your book today, and how is the intellectual dark web and a critique of the new right still relevant today?
Well, I mean, I think it is relevant, very relevant, arguably. But look, obviously, on some level, it's we're in an extraordinary moment, and so I don't want to. I think there's direct through lines to understanding some of where we're at that are in this book, and the intention of the book was not just to be a polemic about a particular group of people. It was to use them as a launching point to make a bigger argument about the ideological failures of the time we're in, and the weaknesses of the left, and then give what hopefully is a little bit of help with a new framework. So I think if you look at it as that, this particular exercise in self-branding, I think I'm actually quoting from my book, is already pretty much done. It was a flash in the pan in 2018. Now, that being said, I mean, all of these figures still certainly have influence and followers, and have real, they're famous, famous members of the pundit class. But I think the thing that I wanted to do in the book, and it might surprise some people, and I hope I pulled it off, was honestly, I mean, I'm happy to do videos about how silly and dumb Dave Rubin is. I think there was, particularly a couple years ago, it was very important to lay out some critiques of Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and so on. But the real purpose of the book was actually to say what's interesting about this intellectual dark web is that, like they themselves constantly say, there is a little bit of intellectual diversity in it. And in fact, there's an intellectual diversity that covers pretty much all of the bad ideas and ideological frameworks that we could use today, from, let's say, the neoliberal center to the hard right. Another image I'll use in the book, which I think frames this, is Bhaskar Sunkara has a great a notion of Hungary station, Singapore station, and Finland station. And what he means, just really briefly, is Hungary is, say, that represents the Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Netanyahu world. That is the neo-authoritarian tendency. And that tendency is to some extent represented in the intellectual dark web. They would deny it fiercely, but there is some of the same preoccupations about immigration, about lost hierarchies, this type of thing. Then in Singapore, and again, this is a really, really broad way, but it fits, is the idea of let's have technical, scientific, and capitalist competence at the expense of democratic process. And that is certainly represented in the intellectual dark web. And then there in Finland station is, it's Lenin going back to the Soviet Union, and without litigating the entirety of Soviet history, which is obviously not the time and place, we can all agree that on some level, 1917 represents a human impulse to more broadly democratize our lives. And obviously, I think that impulse manifests in any number of ways, from general strikes to the freedom struggle in South Africa, to the social democratic agenda of Bernie Sanders, to the presidency of Lula, to indeed, the Cuban Revolution. And my book is an attempt to say that third option, that Finland station, is not, it's got some momentum, but it does not have the power in today's world. The world is really a contest in terms of governing between Hungary and Singapore station. And also we need to build a really successful Finland station project. And the last thing I'll say really briefly is what it attempts to do I'll just leave it like this, is also address why is it that in the pop culture, and this is, I think, has changed in the last couple of years to some extent, but it's still a factor. Why do these arguments find such enormous weakness in sort of liberal terrain? And what can be a deeply appealing answer that speaks to people's material conditions, but also has, by the way, a global answer, not just one that responds in American terms, which is what most of these debates end up looking like.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I want to ask you first in response to that, and that's a terrific answer, and I kind of knew that was coming, obviously, but when you think about these intellectual dark warriors, do you think that they conceived of their project as one which was aimed primarily at Finland station? Was in a conscious alliance between Hungary and Singapore there, or do you think that what you had is a sort of really a split between Hungary and Singapore? I mean, it was the left that they're targeting, actually, the socialist left, in your opinion?
That's a yes and no, because I think you're right. I think a lot of it is actually interscene fights and different kinds of liberalism. If we think of this, ideologically, it's an argument between 1980s, New Republic hierarchy liberalism with sort of woke liberalism. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think and even though, of course, and I talk about in the book, like obviously Jordan Peterson's understanding of socialism is laughable, and debating a foremost Marxism scholar and only reading the Communist Manifesto. I mean, all of this stuff is easy pickings, but I do think in all of these cases, and one way in which I want to indicate in an extremely broad sense, a socialist project and a cosmopolitan socialist project is absolutely different than a woke liberal project. And hopefully it diagnoses and provides alternatives to all of the huge problems in that project. The one thing that I would say, though, and I think we need to get more nuanced, but if there is a continuum of liberal to left versus technocratic to right versus the IDW, is definitely this idea of, do we try to historicize various hierarchies, or do we try to naturalize them? And a lot of the IDW preoccupation is certainly, they're very into culture controversies, and they're very into, some combination of ISIS and college students is ruining the world, and, all that kind of discourse. And particularly with Peterson, but you hear it, certainly with all of them to some extent, probably most pronounced with Peterson and Shapiro, but I've actually heard Harris on this boat as well, is definitely the idea that capitalism is a naturally existing, it makes sense outside of history. It is something more akin to a scientific or mythological process and not a historical one. And that is, where it tracks, because we don't need to understand the history of racism. We don't need to look at gender relations. We can, let's look at some quack science or whatever. I think that's where there is some synergy, but they're very consciously, particularly Peterson, when he was on the scene, was quite concerned about maintaining the legitimacy of capitalism, in my perception, at the very least, warning of the dangers of Marxism. Now, whether or not he, understood Marxism, I think is obviously a massive question mark, which, I get to.
I would say it's not even a question mark. The answer is just no, he didn't. No. So I guess what I want to, here's the thing that I'm noticing right now, and it's not really happening I haven't seen it from the American IDW, but I've seen it from kind of their British doppelgangers. So people like Brendan O'Neill or this guy Douglas Murray. I don't know if you've even heard of him.
Yeah, sure.
But they have kind of shifted their critique from a critique of wokeness and what used to be called social justice warriors, or the intolerant left, or the hyperbolic left. What do they accuse people of? Virtue signaling, the virtue signaling left. From that to, they've actually held on to all the same terminology and critiques, but now they're not aiming it at people who are concerned about white supremacy in Shakespeare or something like that, but they're aiming it at people who are telling others to stay home and not go to the pub. They're aiming it at people who are calling for others to obey the calls for social distancing and sheltering in place. And they're talking about the coronavirus outbreak as if it is just another symptom of, they walk a line on this, but as if it is just another symptom of our hypersensitivity. And, this is all happening within the last week. I'm seeing these kinds of tweets or these kinds of posts or even videos. And to me, it's very obvious that this speaks to sort of the danger of their critique and how that was in there all along. But I also, if they might have reached a limit. I mean, if their people are going to buy that at all. But what do you think? Well,
I mean, actually, I think, to be honest, and Douglas Murray wasn't in the book, maybe should have been, but someone like Sam Harris, I think, is much more like a kind of historical oddity, in the sense that the preoccupations with atheism and the, the hysteria about Islam combined with, very conventional, just sort of Clinton style politics, and then some self-development stuff, which is actually important to get into, with the kind, I don't know what Sam Harris has said, but I have to say, as somebody who's been ultra critical of him, I would actually find it hard to imagine Sam Harris saying, you're being a snowflake if you take the virus seriously. I don't think that that's his worldview, But I also think that what's interesting is I think the kind of more Singapore part of the argument, Sam Harris was very into promoting Charles Murray. I think Sam Harris, he would never own it himself, and he'd say it's unfair and blah, 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 blah. And of course, on his foreign policy, I mean, he was horrifyingly to the extreme far right by any kind of rational estimation or any kind of basic reading comprehension. But that being said, I think the overall template of his worldview is a little bit more difficult than to be updated than some of the others. Whereas, I don't know what Douglas Murray is saying today, but, a week ago, the British government at the highest levels was pushing a herd, immunity idea, and that was given fair hearing in the media. And so I actually think that what a lot of these guys who are more tenable, in the current environment, Hungary station is ascendant. So I think actually there's plenty of room for that, particularly for, more sort of upmarket versions of that. I wouldn't, I mean, there are intellectual sources for the kind of global far right, and it's not the IDW, but I think they're swimming in similar waters. And certainly Douglas Murray already is already a, very right-wing figure. So I wouldn't, I think that stuff could easily be harnessed. I mean, Jordan Peterson, if I recall, before he kind of went off the map, hung out with, with Viktor Orban. So, I think the synergies are pretty obvious. And by the way, this is another thing that I mean. There was a great piece in the New Republic a couple of months ago tracking how Davos, which we could certainly see as some representation of Singapore world, that in the initial phase of Trump's election, there was definitely some, concerns. What are we doing here? And hey, we're all oligarchs, but we want to be nice enough and care about the environment or whatever. And in the last couple of years, Bolsonaro and Trump, and I would imagine certainly Modi, have been ultra praised and treated extraordinarily well at Davos, because at the end of the day, kind of hyper-capitalist, not democracy-friendly projects are relatively easy to synergize, particularly when most of the Hungary projects, for all their rhetoric, don't really even come along with like actual social safety nets anyways. So I think, I don't know about the particular infrastructure that was built up around the IDW. I think it's been diffuse. I think some people have graduated from it and they're, reading and watching much better and more sophisticated things. And they just took the, kind of interest in ideas and went to way better places and more interesting places. And then I think people if they're kind of still on that track, I would imagine it would be hard to imagine it doesn't lead more towards, in Dave Rubin's case, just kind of, being a goofball and, sort of goofy Trumpism. But, I think in the upmarket right-wing stuff.
Someone in the chat, and I'm not really wanting to pull from chat quite yet, but I saw this and I thought we should address this. So can you help him out regarding Singapore and Hungary and what that means in your metaphor, those references? Because he says,
okay. So if you didn't,
Singapore and Hungary.
All right. So if you didn't see it, the idea is just really simply, Viktor Orban is a major figure in the sort of global neo-authoritarian politics. And so we've got Donald Trump, we've got Jair Bolsonaro, these kind of villains that, and it's important, they're not all the same, but in different ways, they're running a project of illiberal democracy with extreme xenophobic, anti-global policy and rhetoric, and also capitalism. Singapore station is represented by Singapore, and everybody, if you're really curious about this, you can read Lee Kuan Yew, who founded modern Singapore. He wrote a book, I think it was called From Third World to First World, and it's really, and again, this is a definitely a illiberal society. There is certainly not rights in the economic sphere that socialists would focus on, and there's not many rights in the liberal, rights sphere that liberals would focus on. And where they are different than, say, a Hungary to some extent is there is some sense of pluralism and multiculturalism, unified in a kind of national identity, but not, but a bit more open. And a real focus on, rationality in certain ways. It's a major trading nation, so there is a happiness and a receptivity to globalization, and as an example, there's environmental policies. There's different, there is more of that. I think how someone like Mike Bloomberg would like to conceive himself. Totally anti-democratic, very pro-capitalist, very interested in using the state to monitor and nudge behaviors, but not populist in sentiment, and probably willing, to responsibly speak out against racism, as an example. And also capitalism, I want to be clear in the sense that, capitalism can, in certain instances, we need to broaden how we talk about capitalism, right? Like the part of capitalism that really is global, where it can, in certain specific ways, as an example, fight racism in a very narrow sense. If you're running a competitive global firm, on some level, if you're thinking strategically, you need to have the best person for a position to make money. That doesn't to say that all these other things, don't play a role in it, but that is different than a hyper-capitalism wedded to a nationalist or ethno-exclusivist project, right? And then Finland station was, that's where, Lenin going back before the 1917 revolution, and we take that as an example of the fulfillment of Marxist ideas, which was the idea that, hey, we're freeing ourselves from monarchies in the political realm, the religious realm. We should also have democracy in the economic realm. And that's still, whether we're talking about trade unionism or worker cooperatives or, using technology to generate free time or whatever else, that is a commonality in socialist discourse. So those three stations represent three orientations to politics, and the IDW represents actually very nicely the second two stations, even as, these particular individuals become less and less relevant.
Let's talk about Sam Harris for a minute and Joe Biden. Because one of the things I'm realizing as you describe that is that in the world that we live in, there is no Finland station yet.
Right.
That's something that we have to create. Finland isn't really Finland station in this moment. And but what we do have is, I guess, kind of wings of the IDW competing for power in real time. And at the moment, it looks like, to the extent that we want to think that Bernie Sanders and his campaign was a step towards creating an alternative to our current social political order, that a social democratic turn could turn into a turn towards actual socialism. That step has been curtailed. It seems like, who knows what will happen next. But do you think that, again, that our actual living political options might be contained within the spectrum of ideas that the IDW likes to talk about? And how does Sam Harris fit into that? Do you think he's kind of a Biden representative in there?
I don't know specifically, but I would imagine, I would think he was much more, I would imagine he was a Bloomberg guy, would be my guess. And probably pretty interested in somebody like Andrew Yang. That would be more, I think, the representation of where he would be, if I had to guess. I don't know. But I would be, I would think it would be pretty likely that Sam Harris would be a Biden over Trump voter. I would imagine that. No, I don't think our politics are limited to that. And I think that our politics aren't limited to that in ways that are depressing and terrifying, in ways that should give us some optimism, depending on how we're looking at it. We're starting to see, I've been mentioning this. The reason I've never kind of focused on things like rent strikes or general strikes or things that really, if they are utilized properly, could actually be enormously powerful tools of a mass working class movement, right? Like, again, this is, the reason Marx was so fascinated by labor and focused on labor. I mean, there's a variety of reasons, but one of it was just a very basic power calculation. The other side has everything except for one major thing, which is everybody working. And actually, if you take that away,
we're looking at the consequences of taking that.
I mean, exactly. And that's why we're in this very bizarre hybrid moment. And so I see, on one hand, and I refuse to romanticize it because it's fucking obscene, the reason people are walking off of jobs as sanitation workers in Pittsburgh, as Purdue workers in Georgia, as warehouse workers in Amazon, is because the treatment of these workers is so craven and so despicable that we have, it is, and this is where, frankly, again, even in a much more limited context, the comparison between the United States and, various European models is illustrative, because it's just, I mean, there is a level of barbarism here that really is just stunning. And at the same time, people are starting to do that. And the reason I never talked about that before is that, again, I think it's really important that the left should not write checks it can't cash. And now all of a sudden it's like, by necessity, which is the terrible thing, but in a way that's potentially massive and a real game changer. Like, you're seeing, I saw a photo, and actually it was funny. She tweeted it out and it got a lot of response. And she kind of was like, actually, I want to sort of cool down the focus on this. But it was a picture of a housing complex in Chicago, and people are standing on balconies talking to each other to coordinate a rent strike. I mean, that is extraordinary stuff. So no, I think, again, the thing that, again, left-wing ideas, Finland Station, will only get more relevant, which is great, distressingly, because things are so bad.
Right. But when I talk about politics, I there's a,
you mean in the electoral realm?
Yeah, in the electoral realm, in the realm of the state. There's nobody vying for state power. There's very few people vying for state power who have a Finland perspective. And within the Democratic Party, it seems like the Social Democratic Finland Station wing of the Democratic Party has suffered a major defeat. And I just wonder how you feel like we should go forward after that moment. And also, I guess I should ask, do you expect that the Hungary side of politics is going to triumph in the weeks and months and years to come?
Well, I don't look. Well, first, let me echo what you're saying.
Yeah,
I've been saying this a lot. I'm not going to talk about the overturn window anymore. Period.
Yeah,
it's a bedtime story. It doesn't matter if 65% of Democratic Party voters in the state support single payer. They beat Bernie Sanders. That's what matters, right? So it's a real setback. It's a real bad thing. Now, that being said, there's a lot in flux right now with the primary. I don't think Joe Biden not lasting necessarily means a good thing like Bernie Sanders. I think it means, like, I would be shocked at this point if Andrew Cuomo doesn't get the pinch, doesn't get called in from the bench or totally. I really don't think that Joe Biden is, I don't see it. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't see it. And I also think that Bernie Sanders, again, it's a massively long shot. He's still in play, and we are in extraordinarily bizarre times. So, it's not completely closed yet. It's, 98%, but we're in a 2% who the hell knows time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying it. The idea of him still being in the game is exceedingly unlikely, but it is not just like a fantasy wish fulfillment scenario. Like there is some element of like things are genuinely in flux and we don't know. And he's providing some leadership, and so on. Look, what's very clear is that there's a divide. There is a certain emergence in the Democratic Party that matters. It matters. I think that, there has been some actual leadership shown by like the Rashida Tlaibs of the world, and that really matters.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and the thing with the triumph of Hungry Station is like, and I'll get to the Singapore wing of the Democratic Party in a minute, although frankly, it's an insult to Singapore. They have competence, but we've
got Elizabeth Warren, she's
I think she's a complete non-entity in politics, but
but she's confident. That's her selling point. She's confident.
The thing is, like, is she?
Well,
I feel like that's a brand. Like, I get that she got one thing accomplished before she was even in the Senate, and it's something that is actually being used horribly with the Republican administration. But being that, and she's, ran a disastrous presidential campaign. So I think that, and did nothing in this bill. I wish Bernie, frankly, did a hell of a lot more. I got critiques of Bernie on this, but Bernie did some stuff. Bernie put some points on the board. Warren didn't put any points on the board with this bill from the perspective of what her preoccupations are. So at any rate, that's just my opinion. But at any rate, the Democrats can fuck anything up. It's an enormously dangerous time and in flux. And if we have an election in November with a 25% unemployment rate, Donald Trump is very likely not going to win re-election. Like, I totally agree with all of it. Like, I think right now he's extremely likely to be reelected. I think that the Democrats and liberals have obviously been just utterly catastrophic, and they still refuse to understand, why he's, what's going on with his political coalition, all of that. I still think raw reality, I think a 25% unemployment rate and literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people dying, I think historical precedent applies. He's not reelected president.
Well, if I were him, what I would do is I would do a lot of Keynesian spending as they're doing in the stimulus bill and all of that. And then I would perhaps say, well, I want people to go back to work. I'm sorry that people are unemployed. It's not, if I had my way, we have to make some trade-offs, but then I wouldn't do it. And I'd let the Democrats take the blame for everyone staying at home.
Well, I think he's already started that.
Yeah, right. He started that. But I think that's my concern, and this is maybe I'm hoping this is how he's thinking, rather than him actually sending people back to work in the middle of a pandemic. This is just politics, so that he can get all of his left-wing critics in the Democratic Party to rail against him trying to send people back to work, and then take the blame for the economic crisis a bit more than they would otherwise. But that people won't die, that we'll have in the massive numbers that we could see, that we'll actually see the shelter in place rules kind of hold for longer than anyone's expecting and against Trump's wishes. And then, that's how I would play it.
I think we got to keep creating. There's a very hard balance to play here, because I think that we see how dumb liberal analysis are. The liberal approach to dealing with Trump is stupid and a disaster. And at the same time, there is a middle way between recognizing that there is, in fact, like today, there's way more intellectual energy and competence closer to power centers in the Republican Party than there is in the Democratic Party, setting aside the good people in the Democratic Party who are the best, obviously. But I think that we can't, this thing with Trump of like, either he's just like a massive idiot and everybody will get that need to get rid of him, which is obviously not true and is a liberal fantasy, can't then be traded for he's just like this, unparalleled political player and and he knows exactly how to calibrate. I mean, he's having an anxiety attack right now because he's afraid about his reelection numbers. And that's why he's talking all this shit. And we know, look, I'm not, I am for counterintuitive thinking at times, and even, at times critiquing maybe a quote unquote scientific consensus. But this is something like, there is not a single, like, even someone like Nassim Taleb, who I kind of was like, oh, I wonder what, I disagree with him a fair amount, but I think he's interesting. I wonder what he thinks. He wrote a blistering critique of the UK government's herd approach.
Oh yeah,
there is not a single, like, if Donald Trump tries to muscle people back to work, a ton of preventable deaths are going to happen if that happens, and the economy, the recession, depression will elongate because so I actually don't, like, again, I think this is a good example where what the liberals need to get is that he's infinitely better on TV. He's speaking more viscerally to people than anybody besides, Bernie's doing a good job, but he's not put forward and nationally.
And I don't think Bernie's as good as Trump to the masses than as Trump is.
Probably really not, but
he's pretty good.
He's pretty good, but I think that might be true, but I think they're doing different enough things that you can grade them differently.
Yeah.
Versus Trump doing stuff and the Democrats just doing nothing, essentially. And I think that's, but on the other hand, and this is where it's weird for me to put on my objectivist hat here, but it's like, there's only so long, like, Donald Trump has luck, but I don't believe in infinite luck, and I think, this is really bad. At any rate,
I actually said to someone the other day that I hope Trump gets reelected, because if he doesn't, it will mean that we'll see millions of people dead in this country. That if he can manage to get through this crisis with only it being as bad as maybe the swine flu or something in terms of everyday people dying, he has a shot at getting reelected. And if it's Biden they put up against him, I don't think there's any shot for Biden to get to beat him. But if
always, I mean, I just want to say though, Doug, like, again, 25% unemployment, there's always a shot. Like, this is and if Bernie somehow gets it, there's a good shot.
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
And depressingly, if Cuomo gets it, there's something of a shot.
Yeah. Well, it would be very odd if Cuomo got it. I don't know what that would do to the Democratic Party to come in and take it from Biden and give it to Cuomo.
Well, they would just tell him that there was soup. I mean, I don't think it would be that hard to figure out.
Yeah, but I mean, what would the Bernie Sanders? What would
Well, this is the thing, Doug. Is what can they do? Like, this is a thing this is where
they can withhold their vote. That's basically all they can do.
Yeah, but holding your vote doesn't mean shit unless it's structural. And this is actually the position that I've been starting to sketch out, that maybe I'm totally wrong, but I'm really trying to rethink this, because I think random protest voting accomplishes absolutely nothing and contributes absolutely nothing. And at the same time, I do think that I think the fact that the left cannot exact a price on anything is a serious problem. So I think, like, look, if I keep saying, I have this idea, I don't know how it would work, but I think, like, look, if 3 million people signed a petition that said there is no way we're voting for the Democratic nominee, and forget the, not the platform, none of that bullshit, but, like, we pick who the vice president is, we get specific promises on Treasury, on labor, like actual appointments and staffing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the flip side, for people who are pissed and disgusted, it would require taking yes for an answer. But
mm-hmm.
I think that because ultimately, and I mean, God bless Bernie Sanders, and we need to, Bernie is still a big advantage. I mean, even after 5 years of unrelenting war on him, he's still one of the most popular politicians in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I mean, it starts to become like a math equation, and there is just as far as mass left politics, there's nothing that solves for lack of mass labor movement. And again, we can redefine labor. Obviously needs to include people who are Uber drivers, people who are on public assistance. Like Adolf Reed points this out perfectly. Of course, we need to update and broaden out what we mean by that. But the very basic concept of millions of people primarily saying, this is about my labor, what I get for it, how it affects my life, and I'm acting, accordingly. There's no way of having a left without that. It just doesn't. But that's a much longer project. In the short term, how do you actually empower people that are trying to do good, like Bernie Sanders and and Ilhan Omar and AOC, which they are? I think is a legitimately open question. So we have to think about.
What I want to do now is let people who are in the chat ask us, and probably just mostly you, some questions, and encourage people to donate some super chats. It always is useful for us these days more than ever. We're looking at all the bookstores closing around the world, which means it's going to be a little bit harder for us to keep going as a book publisher and imprint. So the support we get from people for our digital content is mattering more and more. So if you would like to help out with a super chat, please do. But you don't have to do a super chat in order to get a question answered. And I'll try to keep my eye. I'm not good at catching them all, but I will try to catch as many as I can. And so for the next 15 minutes or so, let's do that. But again, there's a delay between what I'm saying and people actually hearing me. Because so while we wait for a question to come in, Michael, I want to just ask you to state, if you can, what you think the cosmopolitan socialism, this Finland station approach to politics, has to offer right now, and why should people pick up your book to find out more about that argument against nationalism, against neoliberalism, and for an internationalist working class left politics?
Well, I think what we need to do is three things. One is build frameworks for that mass left labor mobilization, and recognize that many liberal projects, that some might be laudable and correct in intention, some might actually be really toxic, some might be complicated and require some rigorous thinking and nuance, but that mostly the way they are deployed and used and harnessed is precisely the opposite of generating a mass coalition. They're used to bifurcate, split. And so we need a serious answer to that. Then the other two things are, we need to speak to people's desire for personal meaning and agency. This is another thing that the left needs to have: a discourse and answer and ideas, and at the very least openness to spiritual questions, to a sense of self-making in the world. And third, we need to combine this materialist orientation, this unitary orientation, this ability to also then attend to people's personal desires and aspirations, with something that is actually truly global. And I'll make a real specific case here, and it actually does go back to some of the Singapore conversation. In the 1990s, there was a huge debate about human rights. And there's a lot of work that's come out in the last couple of years. People like Heidi Matthews and Samuel Moyn have written great critiques of human rights discourses. And in the 1990s, the argument, though, was primarily between Western hegemonic imperialists, who absolutely carried human rights discourse along with, various bombing campaigns and so forth. And they said, essentially, look, there is universality. We're not, it's not a racist project in the sense that we think that every human being, east, west, north, south, has rights. Now, we violate their rights all the time and so on, but ideologically we discourse that from Croatia to Rwanda, from Bolivia to Serbia, to Australia to Morocco, everybody wants free speech, everybody should have a right to vote, and so on. In the 1990s, the primary, and now obviously we're in a much different moment with these nationalist projects. That's infinitely more contested than it was back then. But you had these Asian leaders, Mahathir in Malaysia and Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and they said, no, bullshit. We have something called Asian values. And incidentally, we're doing really well. Our economies are growing. We have social cohesion, and we don't view things in the same way. We don't think you should be able to publish whatever you want to publish in the newspaper, not because we're, protecting our own private interests, which is, we know the case, but because we're protecting social cohesion. And you can laugh at us. Again, like Singapore, you really could get caned for spinning at a certain point in Singapore. That actually wasn't a myth. That was a punishment that was implemented, probably not regularly, but it existed. Amartya Sen, who's one of my favorite, philosophers, not a Marxist, but very highly motivated against poverty philosopher and brilliant guy. He came and he intervened and he said, these positions are both totally wrong. And what's interesting is that the Asian values position actually tracks with the right-wing neo-populists and some of the epistemic closure woke discourse, because they both are saying there's no universals ever. It really is mediated specifically through context. And of course, and we'll get to Sen in a second, no sane person would, context deeply matters, because of course the other side is the imperialist Western hegemonic narrative. And actually, you see this in IDW, right? Like there's either the implication that people from certain backgrounds, they're Muslims, so they can never have decent societies, or, there is this thing called capitalism and reason or whatever, and the West created it. So you actually can really track these. And what Sen did was he said, okay, the Asian value types are totally wrong. Of course, every single human being does not want to be rounded up in prison because they spoke out against corruption or something. And yes, people want some freedom and ability to express themselves politically and socially, of course. And then on the other hand, no, the West did not invent these things. And even the modern mechanisms we're talking about, like, it's crazy. Like, there isn't an unbroken chain from Athens to, the British Parliament. These are complicated, difficult historical processes, and obviously selectively granted and not granted. And so what he did was he did a broad global reading. He was like, okay, let's talk about Confucianism. Here's all these quotes from Confucius that actually do say things like, a leader should never silence people's dissent because it will undermine the community. Here's a discourse from Africa on how to have a democratic decision-making, a deliberative process. Here's a discourse from Islam in India, and so on. And again, his point wasn't that all of these examples are all the same, or they all have modern parliaments or whatever else. That's not the point. The point is that the aspirations of what we call rights are universal. And paradoxically, we realize they're universal by rooting them in different sources. And I think this is incredibly important today. And I think it does a lot of work, because instead of, this kind of endless epistemic, position arguments, we start to really, truly recognize that we do live in a global world. We do have obligations to each other, and we share incredibly elemental bonds as workers or as people who don't want to deal with a planetary crisis. If we're, say, just let's keep it simple, the 99%. And then on the other hand, we also realize that why you should be reading the Pink Tide leaders right now, and Cabral and Fatima Mernissi, and looking at various models of engagement and strategy and governance and philosophy from every corner of the world, because that is both necessary for building the project as broad as it needs to be, both internationally and in a pluralistic society like the United States. And it also makes us the best of globalism, which is not the Singapore version, which is that it's a big giant shopping mall that we can all go in, but that it's an actual, in a positive sense, and I use this unapologetically, it is a global brain. It is something that we can all work together, we can synchronize, we can actually add. And the last thing I'll say, and this I'll get a little bit sentimental about, I actually think that the irony to me, it's one thing to point out, hey, isn't that amazing that somebody is some alt-right fucking asshole and they love hip hop? Yes, of course. And that debunks the silly liberal notions that like, oh, well, people like hip hop, so racism isn't going to be a problem, or, some total trash like that.
Mm.
Now, on the other hand, from the perspective I'm saying, though, is do you really want to go down that road where you buy into this despicable, narrow belief system, which we'll object to politically, historically, and morally, but also, let's be real, that is a hell of a lot less interesting. And I actually think you have to be real that you are children of globalization, no matter what kind of ridiculous narrative you're building for yourself. And I can prove that historically, because even the Greeks were also African and South Asian. There's no such thing as East-West, ultimately, in terms of global cross-pollination has existed as long as we've had the ability to travel. And also, I'm going to suggest that this is a much more compelling way of being in the world. And incidentally, unlike a lot of the super narrow arguments about some of these things in the States, this is a global argument. And really, and again, what it also holds, and then I'll stop, is that yes, context, experience, positionality matters. It can also matter in a positive direction in terms of adding to dynamism for everybody. And that yes, there is universal aspiration, there is universal experience, and those things have to be part of the mix, or there is no chance of reversing capitalism.
That was very well said. And if I get a chance, maybe I'll come back to this video and clip that out and just run that on its own. That was excellent. We do have some questions coming in though, and some super chats. And I want to encourage people with the super chats, but also the questions. But if you give us a super chat, I will be sure to get your question if there's one on the screen. But the first question that I saw was, what could Bernie have done to get the majority he needed?
So this is really tricky. I think, this is a paradox. So a big problem. One, I just want to say outside of the gate, Bernie and his campaign did a hell of a lot right, and I think we should not forget the enormous odds that he's really up against. And in fact, as an anecdote to some of the radical critiques of Bernie, yes, we can all agree and understand intellectually that this is just a basic social democratic agenda, but that's not how Capital saw it. The idea of him being president scared the shit out of them, and there was an unremittent war. So let's be real about that. And they harnessed millions of people, and they've done a lot right. Now, what I think they did that could really be an improvement, and I think goes back to, in some ways, the ethos of my book. In 2016, they needed to broaden out their coalition from there, and they enormously did that successfully with Hispanic people. But I would just say the attitude should always be addition, not subtraction. So even the frame of like too white, too male, too white, too male. No, too narrow, let's expand. Is just even. And then the second thing is, how do you do that? Well, I got to tell you, a bunch of kind of like woke discourse, or by the way, radical socialist discourse on Twitter is not going to be what might mitigate a disadvantage in a conservative state like South Carolina. And that's the third point I'd make that some people don't like, but I'm sorry, it needed to be a hell of a lot more normied up in this sense. In 2018, what got the Democrats the House? Mostly affluent people, many of whom women, who loathe Donald Trump. That's it. Now, Bernie, of course, that's not what the campaign is about. The campaign is about solving big long-term problems. That's no doubt. But you need to sit down and you need to say to yourself, okay, we've got our army. We've got an amazing, we've got the highest floor of anybody. And of course, ultimately, my campaign is about giving people health care, solving the problems, and so on. But we know that a lot of Democratic primary voters are people that don't want to hear about revolution. They don't want to hear about this and that. They want to know you can beat Donald Trump. So how do we send dual messages? And I think, frankly, and that the message from the beginning needed to be much more about electability. It needed to be much more about how these aggressive moves for change. And he did some of that. But honestly, again, people don't like this. And this is where, I want people also to see, though, that I'll go against my own instincts. It's very crazy. It's very easy for me to criticize the woke stuff because I am not there ideologically. But I have nothing but admiration for Castro in Cuba, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bernie shouldn't have been talking about that the last couple of weeks. Like that's not the time in a presidential race.
Well, they kind of forced him to talk about it.
They look, absolutely, but going and in states where seniors are determining it and still talking about a political revolution, drop it.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
And I think so I would just, and then also this is where, and if we're on, if we're in a left liberal conversation, the just unbelievable distraction and stupidity of the Warren campaign, because I think that basically it was a perfect distillation of like, basically the professional managerial class is actually very small. It doesn't really represent that many actual votes, but it has this enormous disproportionate cultural power. And it was this bizarre thing where on one hand, you couldn't just have a proper debate with Warren because of all this unity lie. And that was total bullshit. And people indulged that for way too long. That was just embarrassing and ridiculous. And then also beyond that, again, it wasn't that. It was like, it became, the diagnosis was right, but the prescription was wrong. It was like, so what are we going to do to, get more African-American votes in South Carolina? Like, by the way, this is like a dreary, depressing thing, but like, Jim Clyburn really matters in South Carolina.
It's a conservative voting bloc. It's a conservative voting bloc. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't go for it. But here's different. Here's what they're not going to listen to, Arlo Guthrie or Woody Guthrie and get all excited.
Well, that's also another distinction, right? Is like and I always interview Adolph Reed on this. Again, there is no singular African American voting bloc. It's ridiculous. Right. It's actually very racist and essentialist. But regardless, what I mean is like, if they took 2 years to figure out how to get Jim Clyburn to not endorse, if that was possible, to stay neutral, that would be more effective than a gazillion, totally laudable and whatever, but like, the disparity inside the disparity. Because, that stuff is correct. I think it played some role. I think some of it needed to be done, but there was this correct understanding about broadening out the coalition. And then, it was like, okay, we got to go, right. We got to build an extension on the House. Let's go jump in the swimming pool. It didn't match. It didn't match strategically.
I think that Bloomberg had a better shot at beating Biden in South Carolina than Bernie did.
No, I don't know about that.
It didn't end up being the case. But I mean, the point is that a lot of people in the South wanted to vote for who they thought could beat Trump, and that was all that mattered. And it was the same.
And what I'm saying, Doug, is that if Bernie started with that as strategic assessment a year ago of, we've got the core of our campaign, and then we recognize that a huge part of the Democratic Party just cares about this electability question. And then part of it is you need to just nuke Warren immediately, not fuck around, campaign against her, drop, talk about her law clients, or I don't care if that's unfair, campaign against her, run a fucking campaign. And then spend a year talking about Risky Joe. And I think that if you did that, because again, we're talking like, is Bernie going to win South Carolina?
No.
Extremely unlikely. But I got to tell you, the difference between, if he lost South Carolina by 4 or 5 points after that string of wins, he would still be in a very strong position. I mean, it wasn't just the winning. It was a fucking blowout. If that was a close margin, which I actually absolutely think it could have been. I think between the youth mobilization and a different strategy to neutralize his weaknesses and appeal to a broader set of older voters, I think it could have been a much smaller margin. And that would translate to, it would also mean the consolidation would be harder.
I'll tell you though, I've never seen anything quite like what they did after South Carolina, where they came in and everyone dropped out, everyone got behind Biden, and there just seemed to be this momentum. And I also think there might have been some, there no doubt about it, there was voter suppression on Super Tuesday. Okay, so someone asked, is it wise to unionize workplaces right now? Why or why not?
What workplaces? I mean, generally, of course say yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. Because the problem with questions like that is like, as a broad generic principle, of course, probably
Yeah.
there's other things that should be turned into worker cooperatives. There's other situations where that just doesn't even apply. That isn't even the way, like, two people who do like a little graphic design business, or, one person works full time and there's a bunch of people that are part time, like, I don't know.
It's hard to unionize when you're getting laid off.
And that's also true. But I think the broader point, though, of like, you need unionism. Yes, 100%.
So someone says, keep up the great work, guys. I have a piece I wrote about the left. Remind me to send it to you, Michael. Keen for your book. Much love. Keep fighting. So that's not a question. Let's see if I can find another question here. We have we got a $10 super chat. Can't wait for your book, Michael. Is there any version of identity politics worth saving, for example, intersectionality, that includes a class analysis?
So I'm at a point where I'd say no. And the reason is because, and again, it's in the conclusion of my book, I write about South Africa's Freedom Charter of the African National Congress. And I've talked about this with Adolf Reed. So one is philosophical. I do think that class is not just another variable. I think it's the engine.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can understand a lot more of the situation we're in by understanding class than anything else. Now, I will say too, is I also actually think a lot of issues that come under the umbrella of IDPOL or what, like, again, I think there is spiritual, psychological, emotional, and I think a lot of the things that actually have to do with beliefs and behaviors and actually figuring out mature, intelligent, and healthy ways of approaching those things. I actually think that's the world of, like, I get the most insight from people doing spiritual and psychodynamic work who understand politics and race and gender and things like that. Absolutely. Not just some new ageism. And the third thing I'd say is that, and I want to, and again, because I really want to globalize this, a real project, and again, I think this is actually one of the reasons it's so important it's global. It's in the charter. I mean, the charter says, and then the language there is non-racialism, along with income redistribution. The idea, the notion that you would absolutely fight just with everything against those categories of oppression is part and parcel of that project. It's actually inseparable. And again, let's look at it just in a really practical way. And I think we need to do this more, frankly, because let's just look at numbers. A professional managerial class who might be preoccupied with these questions, with all of the attendant hypocrisies and shallowness of analysis, is a very small part of the population. To start building a broad mass-based movement, there also needs to be some element of not, you can't be controlling people's discourses and beliefs and all their behaviors and all that. That needs to go out the window. But you do need to say, like, you need to actually be 100% not an asshole and support everybody's rights and equity in a substantive, actionable way, because we cannot do what we need to do without that. I used to be very much of like, all of these things are compatible, and I don't want to throw out, like, I still, I read bell hooks as an example. It's not a question of closing intellectually. That would also be a mistake. But I do think that at some point, if concepts are always weaponized and misapplied, we have to ask why. Like, what is in the DNA of a project that can make it, like the funniest one I saw today was Ryan Grimm was saying how the debt collection agencies are fighting to protect themselves during this time so they can keep terrorizing you. And one of the things they're using in Congress is, with the Republicans, it's easy, which, fuck you, paid, who cares, die. And one of the talking points for Democratic members is that we have really diverse workforces that would be jeopardized if we can't call people and terrorize them right now.
Right.
So
I want to jump in on the intersectionality thing too, and just say two things. It's important to understand where the idea of intersectionality came from, what's legitimate about it, and what its limits are. So it came out of the economic crisis of the mid to early 70s. And what had happened was General Motors had, after the civil rights movement, they were hiring African Americans for all sorts of positions, and they hadn't been as early, as recently as the 60s, they hadn't been. And then the economic crisis came, and because they had a seniority-based system, people who were more newly hired were the first to be let go, and that ended up being a lot of African American people and also a lot of African American women, and so in the secretary pool. And so now the larger problem was that the working class as a whole was being laid off en masse, and the unions weren't able to really protect them from an economic crisis. And the crisis of capitalism itself was the larger problem, but the immediate problem for those people was that they didn't have seniority because of the racism they had faced for generations. So they, in the courts, wanted to say, look, we are being discriminated against. This is against the law, and we can demonstrate that. And the answer back from General Motors was, well, no, we've had African Americans in our workforce all along, but they hadn't had African American women in the secretary pool. And that was why they needed to think intersectionally. So that's why, that's where that comes from. So on the one hand, it's obviously legitimate to make that claim in that context. On the other hand, it's also very limited because it was looking for a legal redress based on protection of rights within a system which was going to go into crisis and have a universal problem anyway. So I'm not saying that that doesn't make it legitimate. It just means that you need to know what it was for. It's not, intersectionality is not a wide ranging philosophical critique of the society as a whole. It is a legal argument in a particular kind of case.
Which are obviously very important. I mean, I think, I guess the thing too is, again, I would go to Joanna Wiest's work, I'd go to Adolph Reed's work, and I would really look at, again, also the things that are happening in the 70s and 80s. And one thing, of course, that's happening is, and I keep hitting this in a global, multidimensional sense, which is, you need to cover, like, you can't talk about a global movement whose only reference point is 1850s Europe. That's ridiculous. That is actually both a moral and strategic problem. You can't talk about a labor force. You can talk about universal problems and aspirations, and then obviously the labor force has been dissected by race and gender and so on. There's no doubt about it. But you need to combine it with an anti-essentialist critique, because the other thing that's happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, whether it's looking for protecting small pieces of labor or the welfare state as we're losing and losing and losing across the board, is that in academia, the projects are they're just completely retreating from any type of universalist project. And they're really turning into various kind of discourse sort of games. And I think, Joanna Wiest's work, her work is on medical essentialism, which I love, because again, one of the reasons I'm really an anti-essentialist at the end of the day is, like, I truly, like, I reject IQ tests. I am a constructivist. I think race is absolutely, and gender is mostly, a construct, right? Like, I truly believe that. And I think naturalizing hierarchies along that line is the most evil stuff we do. Mm. And then what I like in her work is again, it's very measured. Like, absolutely, when we first started recognizing that, like, people of color weren't in medical trials, or transgender people weren't represented in certain studies or getting delivered the meds they need, these were profoundly important rights advances. And we're at a time now where, just to keep it really simple, there's enormous racism and disparities in infant mortality. And that's absolutely true. And one of the grids you can measure it is racism. There's no doubt about it. And the clearest linear answer to that is a national healthcare system. Now, to be clear, you still probably actually do need to train doctors to not have racial biases when they treat people. That is where this stuff, I want to be really clear. It's not, that's really important. That needs to be there, but that is not, but when somebody says actually, you know, single payer won't get rid of that racism, then we go, whoa, what are you actually doing here? Because you're undermining the one thing that absolutely needs to happen for everything across the board. And
I mean,
and that's the problem. It's not, just to be really, really clear, maybe it's a question of first and second order things in some respects. Maybe, you know.
Okay, someone asked you, does your book discuss Sam Harris? Yes, it does. If you can, if not, can you summarize your criticism here? Or you want to summarize a little bit of it anyway, even though it does?
Sure. I mean, I think Sam Harris. I think he says at the end of his kind of whatever that was he did with Ezra Klein, where he was defending IQ disparity stuff. He said, I think at one point, I'm paraphrasing, but the history doesn't matter. I think that's the distillation of his work, and that's actually why I find him so horrible. I like the idea. Let's take, you know, race specifically. That you could look at the history of this country from slavery through Jim Crow, apartheid, redlining, housing discrimination, and layered on top of all of the labor and distributional problems that affect people across the board and disproportionately people of color because of the labor history and racial history of this country, and gravitate towards a piece of work that systemically devalues and basically pretty much says like, hey, in the 1960s, you know, you stopped formally being allowed to not, you know, allow Black people to vote, that the juice had gone out of the external environment, and that we're looking at innate intelligence differences, and to not only defend that, but actually think that that's somehow, you know, brave and not reflective of a much broader history of how science has been used to naturalize vicious hierarchies like that, I think is a great example. I think his writing on Islam, I mean, Prince MBS disproves Sam Harris's writing on Islam. You know, I always used to say, like, look at the political currents that facilitate, like, the reason Wahhabism spread. It's not because of one reading of the Quran and people have bad ideas or whatever. It's because of Cold War foreign policy and Saudi oil reserves. And believe me, if the Sufis ran Saudi Arabia and their foreign policy aligned with us, all of a sudden we would see a very different Islam exported to the world. And MBS, it was horrible. No way is this a defense of him, but it's like a prince comes along and sees an opportunity to remaneuver and solidify power for himself, and all of a sudden he starts talking about how Islam needs to be tolerant and how women can be allowed to drive and all of these things. You've got to look at the actual practices, not to mention political context of things. And I have found his writing to be, you know, just utterly naturalizing, pseudo-sophisticated, and almost always carrying deeply toxic and, in my estimation, massively bigoted ideas across any number of domains. And he's boring.
So is there any way you can get Sam Harris to legitimately debate you or Sam Cedar, marking it as an honest debate over ideology and rhetoric?
I find it very doubtful. I find it doubtful. I also don't, I don't have the debate fetish. I mean, look, you know, if I would, you know, Sam Harris said we need to have a debate, you know, and you'd also have to have very clear ground rules. I mean, I've seen, you know, the idea of recording a podcast with Sam Harris is like some type of Dickensian nightmare, you know, but but I think that, you know, I don't know. I mean, read the books, read his stuff, read my stuff.
Yeah.
You know, read, I mean, I think debate is fine. I actually think, debate is actually most useful when there actually is a broader shared context for what you're debating. To be honest, I think, you know, I don't know. I mean, look, Sam Harris obviously has a certain, I don't personally find it appealing at all, but he's got a certain type of kind of people find it appealing approach, and he'll have his thought experiments and he'll have his polls, and I would have my historical examples and my understanding of geopolitics. And then, you know, I don't know. I mean, look, I could tell you anecdotally, I know some people who have said, who have definitely said that, you know, my work has kind of brought them out of Sam Harris and IDW, and that's great. But you know, I don't know what debates usually.
Michael, this question is much more important. When are you going to embrace the immortal work critique or value criticism of Marx? That's what someone wants to ask you. I did not set them up to ask you that.
When am I going to embrace the what criticism of
value
Marx?
Value criticism that comes out of Marx.
It's on my
but there's
to-do
also
list.
There's a German school, right, of Marxism that is very focused on value critique and thinks that properly understanding the ramifications of Marx's value criticism should change our politics. And I recently interviewed a few of them. It was kind of it was interesting. It was slow going because of the language barrier. They spoke English fairly well, but not perfectly. I didn't speak any German. But I think they're worthwhile and worth looking into, these Germans. And then Moish Pistone was sort of
okay, I'm a little bit more. I'm not familiar with the German school at all, but I'm familiar with Moish Pistone.
Yeah. So let's see. Someone says, let me see if I can find a question that doesn't have a dollar amount attached to it. People started, I think because I was going to the super chats, people stopped asking questions without it. Let's see. There's people are talking to each other in the chat about like Louis C.K.'s junk and
is there any? I mean, is there any? If there's anything else, any other questions? But
yeah,
we can wrap up.
Yeah, let's wrap up here.
Okay.
But I think this was a great conversation. Of course, you should come back on fairly regularly to keep pushing the book, and also to help me get through in this political moment. I just would want to tell everyone: stay home, stay safe, stay well,
please,
and you know, don't give up the fight, I guess is what I would say. But I'll let you have.
And take care of yourself.
Yeah,
take care of yourself. Take tech breaks. If you can, read an actual book. Move your body a little bit. You know, you can't. There is some. We tried actually on an episode I have coming out for patrons this weekend that we talked about the origins of self-care, among many other things, and how it's turned into this, like, you know, horrifying PMC parody of itself. Mm-hmm. Ironically, it actually goes back to like Maoist splinter group, essentially recognizing like I actually need to have some human subjectivity here and take some care of myself. So I would suggest in that spirit, take some care of yourself and be safe.
All right. I'm going to run the end credits and in the broadcast.
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between